Hello, my very inquisitive mortal soul. This is Venus Callida here. I decided that I didn't want to sleep in the ruins tonight. I wanted to come out above ground and set up my campfire, got my safety bucket here, and I wanted to tell you a story about the ash tree. And this story is written by M.R. James, and it's actually written quite a lot of stories you might find interesting. And this story is the ash tree. I like it because I grew up surrounded by Mountbatten ash trees, and they're very beautiful. I used to sit in them all day. All day, if I wasn't swimming, I was hanging from a branch of an ash tree. So, I want to tell you about this story. And the ash tree, if you're scared of spiders, you may want to listen to some of my other stories. But for now, let's tuck in and chill, knowing what we're coming to. This is about witchcraft, and it takes us back to 1690 and a witch trial. I'm dedicating this story to Dark Alice, Bunny, and Tishy Adams because I know this might just be your cup of tea. There was a landowner. He wanted to ensure a local woman is condemned as a witch and executed. But this same landowner dies shortly afterward in mysterious circumstances. Half a century later, the landowner's grandson takes up residence in the same house and discovers the ash tree in the grounds of the estate is causing problems. Is this tree somehow connected to the events of 50 years earlier? Let's tuck in and find out. Everyone who's traveled over eastern England knows the smaller country houses with which it is studded. The rather dank little buildings, usually in the Italian style, surrounded with parks of some 80 to 100 acres. For me, they've always had a very strong attraction, with the grey paling of the split oak, the noble trees, the meres with their reed beds, and the line of distant woods. Then, I like the pillared portico, perhaps stuck onto a red brick Queen Anne house, which has been faced with stucco to bring it into line with the Grecian taste of the end of the 18th century. The hall inside going up to the roof, which hall ought to always have been provided with a gallery and a small organ. I like the library too, where you may find anything from a Platz of the 13th century to a Shakespeare quarto. I like the pictures, of course, and perhaps most of all, I like fancying what life in such a house was like when it was first built. And in the piping times of the landlord's properties, and not least now, when, if money is not so plentiful, taste is more varied than life quite as interesting. I wish to have one of these houses, and enough money to keep it together and entertain my friends, at least modestly. But I digress. I have to tell you of a curious series of events which happened in such a house, and I've tried to describe. It is Cassingham Hall in Suffolk. I think a good deal has been done to the building since the period of my story, but the essential features I have sketched are still there. Italian portico, square block of white house, older inside than oak. There's a park with a fringe of woods and a mere. The one feature that marked out this house from a score of others is gone, and you looked at it from the park, you saw on the right of a great old ash tree growing within half a dozen yards of the wall, and almost or quite touching the building with its branches. I suppose it stood there ever since Castringham ceased to be a fortified place, and since the most was filled in and the Elizabethan dwelling house built. At any rate, it was well nigh attained its full dimensions in the year 1690. In that year, the district in which the hall is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reason, if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the persons accused of this offense really did imagine that they were possessed of unusual powers of any kind, or whether they had the will at least, if not the power, of doing some mischief to their neighbors, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the mere cruelty of the witch-finders. These are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved. And the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. But my listeners must judge for themselves. Castingham contributed a victim in the Eau de Fée. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run-of-the-mill village witches only in being rather better off and in a more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers in the parish. They did their best to testify to her character and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castingham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to having watched her on 3 different occasions from the window at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs from the ash tree near my house. She had climbed into the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with peculiarly curved knives. And as she did so, she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion, Sir Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he made, and all he could see when he got down to the garden was her running across the park in the direction of the village. On the 3rd night, had been at the pains to follow at his best speed and have gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house, but he had had to wait a quarter of an hour battering at her door, and then she had come out very cross and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed, and he had no good explanation to offer of his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though there were much more or less of striking unusual kind from other parishioners, Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures at Bury St. Edmunds. Sir Matthews Fell, then the deputy sheriff, was present at the execution. It was a damp, drizzly March morning when the cart made its way up the rough grass hill outside Northgate, where the gallows stood. The other victims, were apathetic or broken down with misery, but Mrs. Mothersole was, as in life, so in death, of a very different temper. Her passionate rage, as a reporter of the time puts it, did so work upon the bystanders, yea, even upon the hangman, that it was constantly affirmed of all that saw her that she presented the living aspect of a mad devil. Yet she offered no resistance to the officers of the law. Only she looked upon those that laid hands upon her with so direful and venomous an aspect that one of them afterward assured me the mere thought of it preyed inwardly upon his mind for 6 months afterward. However, all that she's reported to have said was a seemingly meaningless words. "There will be guests at the hall," which she repeated more than once in an undertone. "There will be guests at the hall." Sir Matthews Fell was not unimpressed by the bearing of the woman. He had some talk upon the matter with the vicar of his parish, with whom he travelled home after the assize business was over. His evidence at the trial had not been very willingly given. He was not specially infected with the witch-finding mania, but he declared then and afterward that he could not give any other account of the matter than that he had given, and that he could not possibly have been mistaken as to what he saw. The whole transaction had been repugnant to him, for he was a man who liked to be on pleasant terms with those above him and about him. But he saw a duty to be done in this business, and he had done it. That seems to have been the gist of his sentiments, and the vicar applauded it, as any reasonable man must have done. A few weeks after, when the moon of May was at the full, vicar and squire met again in the park and walked to the hall together. Lady Fell was with her mother, who was dangerously ill, and Sir Matthew was alone at home. So the vicar, Mr. Crom, was easily persuaded to take a late supper at the hall. Sir Matthew was not very good company this evening. He talk ran chiefly on family and parish matters, and, as luck would have it, Sir Matthew made a memorandum in writing of certain wishes or intentions in regard to his estates, which afterward proved exceedingly useful. While Mr. Crom thought of starting for home about 9:30, Sir Matthew and he took a preliminary turn on the gravelled walk at the back of the house. The only incident that struck Mr. Crom was this. They were in sight of the ash tree, which I described as growing near the windows of the building, when Sir Matthew stopped and said, "What is that runs up and down the stem of the ash? Is it never a squirrel? They will all be in their nest by now." The vicar looked and saw the moving creature, but he could make nothing of its color in the moonlight. The sharp outline, however, seen for an instant, was imprinted in his brain, and he could have sworn, he said, though it sounded foolish, that squirrel or not, it had more than 4 legs. Still, not much was to be made of the momentary vision, and the two men parted. They may have met since then, but it was not for a score of years. Next day Sir Matthew Fell was not downstairs at 6 a.m, as was his custom, nor at 7, nor at 8. Hereupon the servants went and knocked at his chamber door. I need not prolong the description of their anxious listening and renewed batterings on the panels. The door was opened at last from the outside, and they found their master dead and black. So much you have guessed. That there was any marks of violence did not the moment appear, but the window was open. One of the men went to fetch the parson, and then by his directions rode on to give notice to the coroner. Mr. Crom himself went as quick as he might to the hall, and was shown to the room where the dead man lay. He's left some notes among his papers, which show how genuine a respect and sorrow was felt for Sir Matthew, and there's also this passage, which I transcribe for the sake of the light it throws upon the course of events, and also upon the common belief of the time. There was not any the least trace of an entrance having been forced into the chamber, but the casement stood open, as my poor friend would always have in his season. He had an evening drink of small ale in a silver vessel of about a pint measure, and tonight had not drunk it out. This drink was examined by the physicians from Bury, and Mr. Hodgkins, who could not, however, as he afterwards declared upon the oath, before the coroner's quest, discover that any matter of a venomous kind was present in it. For, as was natural, is the great swelling in the blackness of the corpse. There was talk made about the neighbours of poison. The body was very much disordered, and it lay in the bed, being twisted after so extreme a sort as gave to probable conjecture that my worthy friend and the patron had expired in great pain and agony. And what is as yet explained to myself. The argument of some horrid and artful design and the perpetration of this barbarous murder was this, that the women which entrusted with the laying out of the corpse was washing it, being both sad parsons and very well respected in their mournful profession, came to me in a great pain and distress, both of mind and body, saying, what was indeed confirmed upon the first view, that they had no sooner touched the breast of the corpse with their naked hands, and they were sensible of a more than ordinary violent smart and aching in their palms, which with their forearms in no longer time swelled so immoderately, the pain still continuing, that as afterward proved, during many weeks they were forced to lay by the exercise of their calling, and yet no mark seen on the skin. Upon hearing this, I sent for the physician, who was still in the house, and we made a careful as proof as we were able, to the help of the small magnifying lens of crystal, on the condition of the skin on the part of the body, but could not detect with the instrument we had any matter of importance beyond a couple of small punctures or pricks, which we then concluded were the spots by which the poison might be introduced. Remembering the ring of Pope Borgia, with one known specimens of the horrid art of the Italian poisoners of the last age. So much is to this said of the symptoms seen on the corpse. As to what I am to add, it is merely my own experiment, and to be left to posterity to judge whether there be anything of value therein. There was on the table by the bedside a Bible of the small size, in which my friend, punctual as any masters of lens moment, so in this more weighty one, used nightly, and upon his first rising to read a set of portion, and I, taking it up, not without a tear duly paid to him, which from the study of the poor abomination was now passed to the contemplation of its great original. It came into my thoughts, as at such moments of helplessness we are prone to catch at any the least glimmer that makes promise of light, to make trial of that old, by many accustomed superstitions, practice of drawing the sorts, of which a principal instance in the case of this late sacred majesty, that blessed martyr King Charles and my Lord Falkland, was now much talked of. I must needs admit that by my trial not much assistance was afforded me, yet at the cause and origin of these dreadful events may hereto be searched out, I set down the results in the case of may be found that they point to the true quarter of the mischiefs to quicker intelligence than my own. I made then 3 trials, opening the book and placing my finger upon certain words, which give in the first these words from Luke 13:7. Cut it down. In the second, Isaiah 13:20. It shall never be inhabited. And upon the third experiment, Job 39:30. Her young one also suck up blood. This is all that need be quoted from Mr. Crom's papers. Sir Matthew Fell was duly coffined and laid into the earth, and his funeral sermon, preached by Mr. Crom on the following Sunday, had been printed under the title of The Unsearchable Way, or England's Danger, and the Malicious Dealings of Antichrist. It being the vicar's view, as well as the most commonly held in the neighborhood, that the squire was the victim of a recumbrance of the popish plot, his son, Sir Matthew II, succeeded to the title and estates, and so ends the first act of the Castringham tragedy. It is to be mentioned, though the fact is not surprising, that the new baronet did not occupy the room which his father had died in, nor indeed was it slept in by anyone but an occasional visitor during the whole of his occupation. He died in 1735, and I do not find that anything particular marked his reign, save a curiously constant mortality among his castle and livestock in general, which showed a tendency to increase slightly as time went on. Those who are interested in the detail will find a statistical account in a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine of 1772, which draws the facts from the baronet's own papers. He put an end to it at last by a very simple expedient, that of shutting up all his beasts in sheds at night and keeping no sheep in his park, for he had noticed that something was ever attacking that spent the night indoors. After that, he disorder confined himself to wild birds and beasts of chase. But as we have no good account of the symptoms, and as all night watching was quite unproductive of any clue, I do not dwell on what the Suffolk farmers called the Castringham sickness. The second Sir Matthew died in 1735, and as I said, and was duly succeeded by his son, Sir Richard. It was in his time that the great family pew was built out on the north side of the parish church. So large were the squire's ideas that several of the graves on the unfallowed side of the building had to be disturbed to satisfy his requirements. Among them was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the position of which was accurately known, thanks to a note on a plan of the church and yard, both made by Mr. Crom. A certain amount of interest was excited in the village when it was known that the famous witch, who was still remembered by a few, was to be exhumed. And the feeling of surprise and indeed disquiet was very strong when it was found that, though her coffin was firmly sound and unbroken, there was no trace whatever inside of body, bones, or dust. Indeed, it is a curious phenomenon, for at the time of her burying no such things were dreamt of as resurrection, and it is difficult to conceive any rational motive for stealing a body otherwise than for uses of the dissecting room. The incident revived for a time all the stories of witch trials and of the exploits of the witches, the dormant for 40 years, and Sir Richard's orders that the coffin should be burnt were thought by a good many to be rather foolhardy, though they were duly carried out. Sir Richard was a pestilent innovator, and it is certain before his time the hall had been a fine block of the mellowest red brick. But Sir Richard had travelled in Italy and become infected with the Italian taste, and having more money than his predecessors, he determined to leave an Italian palace where he had found an English house. So stucco and ashlar matched the brick. Some indifferent Roman marbles were planted about in the entrance hall and the gardens. A reproduction of the Sibyl's Temple at Tivoli was erected on the opposite bank of the mere, and Cassingham took on an entirely new, and I must say, a less engaging aspect. But it was much admired, and served as a model to a good many of the neighboring gentry in after years. One morning, now in 1754, Sir Richard woke after a night of discomfort. It had been windy, and his chimney was smoked persistently, and it was so cold he must keep up a fire. Also, something so rattling about the window that no man could get a moment's peace. Further, there was the prospect of several guests of position arriving in the course of the day, who would expect sport of some kind, and the inroads of the distemper which continued among his gang had been lately so serious that he was afraid for his reputation as a game preserver. But what really touched him most nearly was the other matter of his sleepless night. He would certainly not sleep in that room again. That was the chief subject of his meditations at breakfast, and after he began a systematic examination of the rooms to see which would suit his notions best. It was long before he found one. This had a window with an eastern aspect, and that was with a northern. This door the servants would be always passing, and he did not like the bedstead in that. No, he must have a room with a western lookout, so that the sun could not wake him early. And it must be out of the way of the business of the house. The housekeeper was at the end of her resources. "Well, Sir Richard," she said, "you know that there is but one room like that in this house." "Which may that is?" said Richard. "And that is Sir Matthew's, the west chamber." "Well, put me in there, for there I'll be tonight," said her master. "Which way is it? Here, to be sure." And he hurried off. "Oh, Sir Richard, but no one has slept there for 40 years, and the air has hardly been changed since Sir Matthew died there." Thus she spoke, and rustled after him. "Come, open the door, Mrs. Chittock. I'll see the chamber at least." So it was opened, and indeed the smell very close and earthy. Sir Richard crossed the window, and impatiently, as his word went, threw the shutters back, and flung open the casement. For this end of the house, one which the alteration had barely touched, grown up as it was with the great ash tree, and being otherwise concealed from view. "Air it, Mrs. Chittock, all today, and move my bed furniture in this afternoon. Put the Bishop of Kilmore in my old room." "Pray, Sir Richard," said a new voice, breaking in on the speech, "might I have favour of a moment's interview?" Sir Richard turned round and saw a man in black in the doorway, who bowed. "I must ask your indulgence for this intrusion, Sir Richard. You will perhaps hardly remember me. My name is William Crom. My grandfather was vicar here in your grandfather's time." "Well on," said Sir Richard. "The same of Crom is always a passport in Cassingham. I am glad to renew a friendship of 2 generations standing. In what can I serve you? For an hour of calling, and if I do not mistake you, your bearing shows you to be in some haste." "This is no more than the truth, sir. I am riding from Norwich to Bury St. Edmunds with what haste I can make, and I've called in on my way to leave with you some papers which we have but just come upon in looking over what my grandfather left in his death. It is thought you might find some matters of family interest in them." "You are mighty obliging, Mr. Crom, and if you will be so good as to follow me to the parlor and drink a glass of wine, we will take a first look at these some papers together. And you, Mrs. Chittock, as I said, be about airing this chamber. Yes, it is here my grandfather died. Yes, and the tree perhaps does make the place a little dampish. No, I do not want to wish to listen to any more. Make no difficulties, I beg you. You have orders. Go. Will you follow me, sir?" They went to the study. The packet which young Mr. Crom had brought, he was then just becoming a fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge. I must say, I subsequently brought out a respectable edition of Polyaenus. Well, that's how it's written. I'm so sorry about the name of it. Contained, among other things, the notes which the old vicar had made upon the occasion of Sir Matthew Fell's death. And for the first time, Sir Richard was confronted with the enigmatic Sûreté biblique, which you could have heard. They amused him a good deal. "Well," he said, "my grandfather's Bible gave me one prudent piece of advice. Cut it down. If that stands for the ash tree, he may rest assured I shall not neglect it, as such a nest of cars and ogs and never seen." The parlor contained the family books, which, pending the arrival of a collection from Sir Richard had made in Italy, and the building of a proper room to reserve them, there were not many in number. Sir Richard looked up from the paper to the bookcase. "I wonder," he said, "whether the old prophet is there yet. I fancy I see him." Crossing the room, he took out a dimply Bible, which he sure enough bore on the fly-leaf the manuscripts to Matthew Fell from the loving godmother, Anne Aldous, to September 1659. Would be no bad plan to test him again, Mr. Crom. I will wager we get a couple of names in the chronicles. Have we here? Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be. Well, well, your grandfather would have made a fine omen of that, eh? No more profits for me. They're all in a tale. And now, Mr. Crom, I am infinitely obliged to you for your packet. You will, I fear, be impatient to get on. Pray allow me another glass. So with offers of hospitality, which were genuinely meant, for Sir Richard thought well of the young man's address and manner, they parted. In the afternoon came the guests, the Bishop of Kilmore, Lady Mary Hervey, Sir William Kentfield, etc. Dinner at 5, wine card, supper, blah, 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 and dispersal to bed. Next morning, Sir Richard disclaimed to take his gun with the rest. He talks about the Bishop of Kilmore. This prelate, unlike a good many of the Irish bishops of his day, had visited his see, and indeed resided there for some considerable time. This morning, as the two were walking along the terrace and talked over the alterations and improvements of the house, the bishop said, pointing to the window of the west room, "You could never get one of my Irish flock to occupy that room, Sir Richard." "Why is that, my lord?" "It is in fact my own." "Well, our Irish peasantry will always have in that it brings the worst of luck to sleep near an ash tree. You would have a fine growth of ash not 2 yards from your chamber window, perhaps?" The bishop went on with a smile. "It has given you a touch of this quality already, for you do not seem, if I may say it, so much the freshest of your night's rest as your friends would like to see you." "That or something else, it is sure, cost me sleep from 12 to 4, my lord, but the tree is to come down tomorrow, so I shall not hear much more of it." "I applaud your determination. Can hardly be wholesome to have that air you breathe straining, as it were, through all that leafage." "Your lordship is right there, I think, but I had not my window open last night. It was rather the noise that went on. No doubt from the twigs sweeping the glass. That kept me open-eyed." "I think that can hardly be, Sir Richard. Here, you see it from this point. None of these nearest branches even can touch your casement, unless there were a gale, and there was none of that last night. They missed the panes by a foot." "No, sir, true. What then will it be, I wonder, that scratched and rustled so? Aye, and covered the dust and all my sill with lines and marks?" At last they agreed that the rats must have come up through the ivy. That was the bishop's idea, and Sir Richard jumped at it. So the day passed quietly, and night came, and the party dispersed to their rooms, and all wished Sir Richard a better night. And now we're in his bedroom, with the light out, and the squire in bed. The room is over the kitchen, the night outside still warm, so the windows stand open. There is a very little light above the bedstead, but there is a strange movement there. It seems as if Sir Richard were moving his head rapidly to and fro, with only the slightest possible sound. And now you would guess, to deceptive is the half-darkness, that he had several heads, round and brownish, which moved back and forth, even as low as his chin. It's a horrible illusion. Is it nothing more? There! Something drops off the bed with a soft plump, like a kitten, and it's one of the window in a flash. Another, 4. After that, there's quiet again. "Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be." As with Sir Matthew, so was Sir Richard, dead and black in his bed. A pale and silent party of guests and servants gathered under the window when the news was known. Italian poisoners, Popists and emissaries infected air. All these and more guesses were hazarded, and the Bishop of Kilmore looked at the tree, and the fork of whose lower boughs, as white torn car, was crouching, looking down. It was a tomcat, and it was looking down the hollow which years had gathered in the trunk. It was watching something inside the tree with great interest. Suddenly it got up and craned over the hole. Then a bit of the edge on which it stood gave way, and it went slithering in. Everyone looked up at the noise of the fall. It is known to most of us that a cat can cry, but few of us have heard, I hope, such a yell. It came out of the trunk of the great ash. 2 or 3 screams there were. The witnesses are not sure which. And then a slight and muffled noise of some commotion or struggling was all that came. But Lady Mary Hervey fainted outright, and the housekeeper stopped her ears and fled till she fell on the terrace. The Bishop of Kilmore and Sir William Canfield stayed, yet even they were daunted. Though it was only the cry of a cat, Sir William swallowed once or twice before he could say, "There's something more than we know of in that tree, my lord. I am for an instant search." And this was agreed upon. A ladder was brought. One of the gardeners went up, and, looking down the hollow, could detect nothing but a few dim indentations of something moving. They got a lantern and let it down by a rope. "You must get at the bottom of this. My life upon it, my lord, but the secret of this terrible death is there." Up went the gardener again with the lantern and let it down the hole cautiously. They saw the yellow light upon his face as he bent over, and saw his face struck with an incredulous terror and loathing before he cried out in distressful voice and fell back from the ladder, where happily he had caught by 2 men, letting the lantern fall inside the tree. He was in a dead faint, and it was some time before any word could be got from him. But then they had something else to look at. The lantern must have broken in the bottom, and the light in it caught upon dry leaves and rubbish that lay there, for in a few minutes a dense smoke began to come up, and then flame, and to be short, the tree was in a blaze. The bystanders made a ring at some yards' distance, and Sir William and the bishop sent men to get what weapons and tools they could, for clearly whatever might be using the tree as its lair would be forced out by the fire. So it was, first, at the fork, they saw a round body covered with fire, the size of a man's head, appear very suddenly, then seem to collapse and fall back. This 5 or 6 times. Then a similar ball leapt into the air and fell on the grass, where, after a moment, it lay still. The bishop went as near as he dared to it, and saw what but the remains of an enormous spider, venous and seared, and, as the fire burned lower down, more terrible bodies like that began to break out from the trunk, and it was seen that these were covered with grayish hair. All that day the ash burned, and until it fell to pieces the men stood about it, and from time to time killed the brutes as they darted out. At last there was a long interval when none appeared, and they cautiously closed in and examined the roots of the tree. "They found," said Bishop Kilmore, "below it a rounded hollow place in the earth, wherein were 2 or 3 bodies of these creatures that had plainly been smothered by the smoke, and, what is to me more curious, at the side of this den, against the wall, was crouching the anatomy of a skeleton of a human being, with the dried skin upon the bones, having some remains of black hair, which was pronounced by those that examined it to be undoubtedly the body of a woman, and clearly dead for a period of 50 years. Dun, dun, dun. This is Venus Callida and the conclusion of the Ash Tree by M.R. James, which is in the public domain. I hope this reading helped you to relax or fall asleep. I hope you found it entertaining. And I hope you all avoid being burned at the stake or hung from a gallows. No joke. No disrespect meant for the terrible losses of life in the past. But I guess maybe mind your own business and don't tattletale on your neighbor. I don't know. Maybe take it from that. Learn from the past. Be wary of all the good advice that comes from people who went through a lot and lived their lives and are trying to warn you so you could save yourself. Come on. Why doesn't anybody ever listen? Anyways. Hopefully you've fallen asleep. So ends another evening of tucking and chill by the campsite in the ruins. This is Venus Callida, and I'll hope to be entertaining you next time.